So Anthony just spoke to some extent about the extent to which students receive certain types of discipline in school and how this might vary by crime. This is an important set of analyses. A district might use these, the results of these analyses and compare them with publicly available data to determine if the district is using exclusionary discipline at exceptionally high rates relative to other places. And that assumes that things are being measured in a similar fashion and using common definitions. I think further these analyses will illuminate if there are certain types of offenses that are being targeted with exclusionary discipline, but maybe more appropriately addressed through other means of discipline. Again, talking about those subjective student offenses that we referenced a little while back. But what these analyses don't tell us is whether certain subgroups of students experience exclusionary discipline more frequently than others. The first step is really to determine what subgroups should be included in the analysis. Federal guidance recommends that districts focus on protected student subgroups. That might include by race and ethnicity, gender, or perhaps disability status. Now, for today and within the report, we focus on race and ethnicity as a protected student subgroup. But it's up to you as the analyst to work with the stakeholders to determine what analyses are most important for the examination you're interested in. All right. So the research question here, does the district use exclusionary disciplinary actions more frequently for some subgroups of students than others? We really, to answer this, need to consider a few things. In addition to identifying the appropriate student subgroup that we want to look at, in this case we're going to talk about race and ethnicity, we also need to produce enrollment frequency counts and percentages by these student subgroups. The enrollment totals are needed for the analyses that we'll discuss in a little bit. So in addition to the total student enrollment, you'll need to go back to your enrollment files and produce the same numbers for the subgroups that you're interested in analyzing. An additional step that you need to take is to determine what the risk index is, what risk index to use to determine whether there are disproportionate disciplinary actions towards certain student subgroups. There are many ways to present risk indices, and there's benefits and limitations to each, so we'll talk about that a bit. To start, you really should think about calculating the risk rate for the student population and subgroups of interest. Anthony talked a little bit about risk rate a few slides ago. The calculation for it is pretty straightforward. It's on page 2 of the report for those that have the report with them. But the rate itself does not provide a measure of disproportionality. This requires some measure of comparison. So from here, we're going to talk about turning the risk rate into various indices to examine disproportionality. We should also note that it's advisable to use multiple indices when you're conducting your analyses of disciplinary data. Again, each have limitations, and we'll briefly mention some of those limitations today. There's a more extensive discussion of those limitations and also benefits in the report, so I'd reference you there. But it's important to keep this in mind because under certain data conditions, only using one index could lead to a misinterpretation of the results. All right. So to start, let's take a look at the risk rate side by side. It's a simple risk index, and it comprises of the risk rates for certain student subgroups and allows you to visually compare the risk rates for each student subgroup in the analysis. So we can see it's a fairly intuitive set of numbers here where we are taking the total students that received any type of disciplinary action, perhaps exclusionary discipline, and dividing that by the total number of students enrolled within that subgroup and just multiplying it by 100 to create our risk rate. and then comparing those rates across the student subgroups visually. You can really take this a step further if you'd like to look at a more detailed risk index and disaggregate the results. For example, you could look at risk for suspension by race and ethnicity, and also by disability status. So from here, we would take this data and extrapolate it out for the various student subgroups that you're interested in looking at. After you've calculated a risk index, it's just an easy extension to then look at risk differences and risk ratios. So we'll talk about those next. All right. So calculating risk differences. Gaps or differences in risk rates when we're using the risk index can be used to analyze disproportionality across subgroups simply by subtracting the risk rate from one student subgroup from the risk rate of another student subgroup. In this example, you see we're subtracting the risk rate for black students as it relates to out-of-school suspensions to the risk rate for white students. Again, I should note this is all fictitious data meant to be a visual example for you of the analyses. In this instance, the risk difference is 12.5 percentage points. Now, what's nice about risk differences, it provides a really clear comparison between the absolute percentage points for two groups. However, the measure is not sensitive to rare events. So, for example, if one subgroup had had a risk rate of 4% and another subgroup had a risk rate of 1%, the risk difference would only be 3 percentage points. But what we're talking about there is really a risk that's 4 times greater for one subgroup compared to another. So it's important to keep in mind the frequency of incidents when we're talking about these various indices. So risk differences speaks in absolute terms. Risk ratios, relative risk ratios, we're talking in relative terms. So to compare the relative differences rather than the absolute, a district might consider a relative rate ratio. To calculate the relative rate ratio, the risk rate for one student subgroup is divided by the rate of a second student subgroup. So here you can see we're using the same data to provide a relative risk ratio as compared to the risk difference. So from using the same data, we see that although there's the absolute difference of 12.5 percentage points, that's interpreted as a 2-to-1 relative risk ratio for black students compared to white students. Now, there are definitely some limitations to relative risk ratios, and we'll cover a few of them here. I think one considerable limitation is that relative risk ratios does not allow you to interpret if the underlying rates are exceptionally high or low. So the example that we provide in the slide here shows four cities or districts, and it's quite clear that City A uses exclusionary discipline much more frequently than City D, and yet the relative risk ratio for both cities is still just 2-to-1. This demonstrates that high ratios are possible even if the underlying risk is low. So this could be an issue if your goal is to discover whether large differences are driven by potentially excessive or unnecessary disciplinary action. Another limitation that should be fairly intuitive is because this is based on division, if the comparison subgroup has no suspended students, when we're talking about exclusionary discipline, the ratio simply cannot be calculated. So, this might affect elementary students, kindergarten students, settings and situations where you have really low numbers or potentially no data at all. And in that case, you may look back to the risk difference rather than the relative risk ratio.